Okay, very good. I couldn't hear any of the introductions. I'm sure you said a lot of wonderful things, Logan. So thank you.
You're so
Hi,
welcome.
hi everybody. As you just heard, my name is Todd Arrington, and I spent 15 years at James A. Garfield National Historic Site up in Mentor, Ohio. I'm not there anymore, but along the way, I learned a lot about James Garfield. Wrote a book about James Garfield, and so I'm very happy to be with you today, and really appreciate the invitation from Logan to be with you all. And hopefully, the audio and video is working well, and everybody can see the screen and hear what I'm saying. And if at any point there's any issues with that, just let Logan know, I guess, and we'll try to get it fixed fixed on your end. So I appreciate the opportunity to do this virtually because I did just start a new job. So I'm actually coming to you down in Virginia. I'm not in Ohio anymore, but anyway, very happy to be here with you today. Logan told me we only have about 5 hours for this presentation because you all want to be home by dinner time. So I will definitely move through this as quickly as I can. Just kidding, of course. I will speed through this as quickly as possible because I know we only have an hour and I do want to give you all time to ask questions at the end. Hopefully this will be enjoyable enough that you'll all want to ask some questions at the end. So we'll just go ahead and jump right in. Really what I call this the last Lincoln Republican, and that's also what I called my book, which is up on the screen here. I originally made this PowerPoint when the book came out back in 2020. So this is not a hard sell for you to buy the book. Believe me, I'm just using the PowerPoint that I originally developed when the book was first published. But I called the book The Last Lincoln Republican because one of the things that I learned and my views on kind of evolved about James Garfield over the years that I spent working in his home up in Mentor is that, he really was pretty strong on civil rights. He was an abolitionist before the war. He fought for the Union during the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, he was a congressman who really fought for civil rights for formerly enslaved people. And so I developed this idea of him as kind of the last Republican president of kind of that first iteration of the Republican Party that started with Abraham Lincoln, a party that was dedicated primarily to equality, social equality, economic equality, and even to some degree racial equality. And so as I was sort of developing this idea and thinking about writing about the election of 1880, this idea of Garfield as the last Lincoln Republican is kind of what stuck with me. And so and the title I ended up giving the book. So maybe by the end of this presentation, you'll agree that it was a great title, or maybe you'll disagree. But either way, it's too late now because the University Press of Kansas published it about 5.5 years ago. So anyway, so what I'm going to do is just really kind of walk you through who Garfield was, how he came to be the Republican presidential nominee in 1880. We'll look a little bit at his Democratic opponent that year, Winfield Scott Hancock, and then kind of wrap it all up at the end with Garfield winning the presidency in 1880. I can see the room, and I'll see if I can actually see everybody. But just by show of hands, did anybody watch the Netflix series that came out recently, Death by Lightning, about Garfield? Some of you did. Okay, great. I wish I could say that series was based on my book. It wasn't. It was based on a different book, which is excellent, Destiny of the Republic by Candace Millard. So if you haven't read that, I definitely recommend it. Death by Lightning is a dramatization about Garfield and the 1880 election, and I enjoyed it. I mean, they obviously took a lot of creative liberties, but you expect that with a Hollywood production. But I think they did a nice job of, if nothing else, putting something out there that was really entertaining and getting people interested in this history, which I think is always a good thing. So anyway, let's get into this. So how did we get here? The 1880 version. When I originally made this presentation, it was in the fall of 2020, when of course we were going into a presidential election that year as well. And so that's why I sort of added the 1880 version here. But the 1880 presidential election is primarily, there are some third party candidates that I do talk a little bit about in the book, but not in this presentation. The two guys that you see on the screen there, James Garfield on my left as the Republican candidate, and Winfield Scott Hancock on the right, my right, as the Democratic candidate. And Hancock is already a very well-known person in this country in 1880, primarily for his military career. We'll talk more about that as we go along. So how did these two guys come to be the presidential nominees in 1880? Well, in my view, the 1880 presidential campaign really started before the 1876 presidential election. You'll probably recognize the guy on your screen. That's Rutherford B. Hayes. He, of course, was the the Republican presidential nominee in 1876. I'm not going to read you the whole quote here. You can all read. But he didn't say in his letter of acceptance, and this is how nominees accepted nomination. Today, of course, they come to the convention and they give a speech. But in this era, nominees of major parties wrote a letter of acceptance. And in the letter of acceptance that Rutherford B. Hayes wrote in 1876, accepting the Republican presidential nomination, he says right there in the last sentence, that if elected, he will not be a candidate for election to a second term. So Hayes was already saying, if I win, I'm only going to be a one-term president. So here we are in months before the 1876 election. The Republican Party already knows they're going to need another candidate in 1880 because Hayes is already saying, I'm only going to serve one term. There's this idea out there that Hayes only served one term because of what happened in this election that we'll talk about here in a second. But in reality, he had committed to only serving one term even months before the election even took place. So the 1876 election, the Republican candidates, Hayes and Wheeler, who was from New York, Ohio and New York, will come back again in this presentation. Ohio and New York together, two very powerful political states at this time and even today as well. So it was Hayes and Wheeler on the Republican side, and Samuel Tilden, who was the governor of New York at the time, Tilden and Thomas Hendricks from Indiana on the Democratic side. And this is a disputed election. There's a lot of things going on with this election. You can see from this map, we even had red and blue states all the way back in 1876. The red states are those won by Hayes, the Republican. The blue states are those won by Tilden, the Democrat. But of course, we all know we don't pick our presidents based on the popular vote. We pick them based on the Electoral College. So as it stood originally, it looked like Tilden, the Democrat, was going to win the presidency in 1876. But there were disputed ballots in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, which just happened to be the three remaining southern states that were still governed under Reconstruction Republican governments. So everybody thought that Tilden had won those states because, of course, white Democrats were not voting for the Republican Hayes in that election. They were voting for the Democratic Party, which was Tilden. But the Republican Party contested the elections in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, those last three southern states that were still being run by Republican governments. And frankly, there was a lot of stuff going on in this election. Some people say it was a stolen election, others say it wasn't. There's no doubt that white Southerners certainly intimidated African-American voters at the polls in these three states, and really in all the southern states. But So there was something to the fact that Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida did have some definitely some funny things going on during this election. Now, if you recall, back in 2000 when we had a disputed election, when it all was about Florida and hanging chads and all this stuff that everybody remembers, probably not so fondly because it went on for so long. We had this disputed election in 1876. Was not decided by a Supreme Court decision like in 2000. It came down to an appointed electoral commission, and it was made up of 15 members. It was supposed to be 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, 1 independent. But the 1 independent eventually resigned because he'd been elected to the U.S. Senate, and he was replaced by a Republican. So you have 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and guess what? It goes completely along party lines. The Republicans, by a margin of 1, say Rutherford B. Hayes is the rightful winner of South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida, and therefore he is the 19th president of the United States. This is a look at the 1876 Electoral Commission. You will notice that, in fact, James Garfield was a member of that commission. So when Garfield voted to make Hayes the next president, to award those electoral votes to Hayes, he inadvertently, of course, paved the way for himself to be a presidential nominee just 4 years later. But anyway, so in 2000, we had the Supreme Court. In 1876, it was the Electoral Commission, which did include the Republican James Garfield. So Hayes, of course, becomes president at the beginning of in March of 1877. And then the Republican Party already is now looking for another candidate for 1880, as we just talked about, because Hayes is only going to serve one term. So who was James Garfield? He was a native of Northeast Ohio, born in what's now Moreland Hills. It was called Orange Township at the time, November 19th, 1831. His father died when the future president was only about 18 months old. So he was raised by what we would think of now as a single mother, because his father had died very young. Grew up wanting to go to sea and become a sailor, but the closest he ever got was working on the Ohio and Erie Canal, and he never even learned to swim. So it's probably good that he didn't become a sailor. He did have a good education. His mother realized he was very smart, wanted him to have an education, so she sent him to the Geauga Seminary, then on to the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, which is now Hiram College in Hiram, Ohio. And then he eventually went on to Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts, where he got a bachelor's degree. Religion was always important to Garfield as well. He was a lifelong member of the Disciples of Christ. While he was a student at Williams College, as a member of the Disciples, Garfield was part of a religious denomination that did not really take an active role in politics. In fact, it was considered kind of unseemly. And so many members of the Disciples just kind of stayed out of politics. And Garfield did that until he got up to Williamstown, Massachusetts to go to Williams College. And on the night of November 2nd, 1855, he went and heard some speeches by some abolitionists that were talking about the situation that was currently going on in Kansas. This is the period that would soon be known as Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers were fighting for dominance in Kansas. So Garfield goes and hears these speakers speak, and this is what really kind of wakes him up to what's going on in the country. And this is one of my favorite quotes from him. "I've been instructed tonight on the political condition of our country. No more slave extension should be the motto bound to every free man's breast. At such hours as this, I feel like throwing the whole current of my life into the work of opposing this giant evil," the giant evil, of course, being slavery. So at this point, James Garfield is starting to become an abolitionist. Never called himself that, didn't use that term for himself because there were some negative connotations associated with that, but he did become what we would think of today as an abolitionist. Garfield married Lucretia Rudolph on November 11th, 1858. They had been classmates at the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute in Hiram. So she was the second first lady after Lucy Webb Hayes, who had higher education in her background. In 1859 October of 1859 was the famous John Brown raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is now West Virginia. This was the U.S. arsenal at Harper's Ferry, a weapons stockpile for the U.S. government. Brown tried to capture the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, hoping to seize those arms and basically institute, a slave rebellion. Because he was a radical abolitionist. He was, of course, captured. His plan did not work. And on December 2nd, 1859, he was executed. He was hanged by the U.S. government for treason. And this is a quote from Garfield's diary entry that day, where he says, "Brave man, old hero, farewell. May your death be the dawn of a better day." And again, we see the awakening of James Garfield as an abolitionist here. The Civil War begins in April of 1861 with the Confederate firing on Fort Sumter. Again, another one of my favorite Garfield quotes here. This is written just 2 days after the firing on Fort Sumter, where Garfield says, "I'm glad we're defeated at Sumter. It will rouse the people. I hope we will never stop short of complete subjugation. Better to lose 1 million men in battle than allow the government to be subjugated." And this is the key phrase here. "The war will soon assume the shape of slavery and freedom. The world will so understand it, and I believe the final outcome will redound to the good of humanity." So this is a quote I always liked when I was working up there at Garfield's home, that I always like to use to show, there's a lot of people today that say this slavery really had nothing to do with the Civil War. It was about states' rights. It was about economics, all this stuff. Here's a guy living through this moment that's saying, it's about slavery. We all know it's about slavery, and eventually everybody will come to realize that. And so here he's saying that just 2 days after the firing on Fort Sumter. Garfield did eventually volunteer to fight for the Union, and so he helped to raise a regiment that became the 42nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. He eventually was the commander of that regiment, and then later went as far as Major General, which was a 2-star general. In the photo you see here, he is a brigadier general, a 1-star. Here he is talking again about slavery. Slavery is the soul of the rebellion, and the incarnate devil which must be cast out before we can trust in any peace is lasting and secure. Again, Garfield really progressing in his views as an abolitionist here. Garfield was very happy when President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Garfield was frustrated with Lincoln because he thought Lincoln should have issued an Emancipation Proclamation as soon as the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter. Think back to that quote I read you a minute ago. You know, it's in his mind, the war is about slavery. So as soon as the Confederates started the war by firing on Fort Sumter, in Garfield's mind, Lincoln should have said, abolition of slavery is part of what the North is fighting for. Yes, we want to preserve the Union, keep the country together, but we are also going to abolish slavery. Lincoln, of course, I think history has borne him out, knew that it was not the right time for that yet. The country wasn't ready for it. So he waited until September of 1862 to announce that he would make the Emancipation Proclamation. He would issue that on January 1st, 1863. So here you have Garfield talking about the Emancipation Proclamation. The President's Proclamation gives great satisfaction among all strong, vigorous men. But another great quote here from Garfield. Strange that a second-rate Illinois lawyer should be the instrument through which one of the sublimest works of any age is accomplished. So, you know, kind of letting his feelings about Abraham Lincoln at the time slip out there a little bit. Of course, later Garfield, like all Republicans, came to revere Lincoln, but at this point, Garfield was still a little frustrated. Garfield actually gets elected to Congress in the fall of 1862 while he's serving in the Army. He's not home in Ohio. He doesn't campaign or anything like that. But he doesn't actually have to take the seat in Congress until the end of 1863. So he's a congressman elect for over a year. And he really kind of had this internal debate with himself about should he go to Congress or should he stay with the Army and see the war through to the end. He eventually makes the decision to leave the Army in December of 1863 and go to Congress. And as he tells it here in his diary, he talked to President Lincoln about this, you know, kind of seeking the president's advice on what he should do. And Lincoln basically told him, I'm paraphrasing here, you know, I have more generals than I know what to do with, some of whom are competent, some of whom aren't. But I cannot spare any Republican votes in Congress. And so he wanted Garfield to go to Congress. And so that's what Garfield did, eventually saying, if the president has said this is his preference for me, and that's what I'm going to do. Garfield, of course, was a very vocal anti-slavery voice in Congress for the duration of his time as a congressman, which ended up being about 17 years. Here's Garfield speaking about the 13th Amendment. If you saw the film Lincoln, 10, 12 years ago now, the Spielberg film that had Daniel Day-Lewis, that film focuses on Lincoln's push to get the 13th Amendment passed by Congress and sent out to the states to ratify. This is Garfield talking about that effort, about that 13th Amendment, which did have to pass through Congress and then go to the states to be ratified. So this is Garfield just basically speaking in support of the 13th Amendment, which, of course, is the amendment that abolished slavery. So this is just Garfield talking about the proposed 13th Amendment in January of 1865. This is a great quote from Garfield. This was right after the end of the Civil War. This was actually a July 4th address he gave in Ravenna, Ohio, not too far from his home in Mentor, where I used to live. But this is where Garfield is already starting to think about what does this post-Civil War Reconstruction period look like for Black people, for formerly enslaved people. And so again, a great quote here. Have we given freedom to the Black man? What is freedom? Is it mere negation? Is it the bare privilege of not being chained? If this is all, then freedom is a bitter mockery, a cruel delusion, and it might be questioned whether slavery were not better. It's basically saying we can't just say, okay, you're no longer enslaved, but not not help these people who have been enslaved for so long, not give them opportunities, not try to put the power of the government behind the effort to make it right, and to try to give them opportunities to become landowners, to start businesses, to have the vote. So this is Garfield basically saying, if all we're going to do is tell people they're free and nothing else, then we're not really doing much for them. We've got a lot more responsibility to formerly enslaved people, is basically what he's saying here. In May of 1868, at Arlington National Cemetery, the very first National Decoration Day ceremony took place. Decoration Day is what we now know as Memorial Day. And Garfield himself was actually the keynote speaker that day at this event in Arlington National Cemetery, which of course had once been the home of Robert E. Lee prior to the Civil War. The photo you see there on the screen is an actual photo from that day. It doesn't show Garfield specifically, but it's sort of a photo of the speaker's rostrum that day from which Garfield spoke as the keynote speaker. And this is another instance of Garfield reminding people that slavery was the root cause of the war. We began the war for the Union alone, but we had not gone far into its darkness before a new element was added to the conflict. God had linked to our own the destiny of an enslaved race, that their liberty and our union were one and inseparable. So again, this is Garfield reminding the country that slavery was the root cause of the war, and we have many, many more responsibilities to formerly enslaved people than we've lived up to so far. Here's Garfield in 1866 while he's campaigning for Republican candidates for the midterm elections. This is where he basically is coming out against Andrew Johnson, who became president when Lincoln was assassinated. Johnson was a Democrat, but he was a Southern Democrat. He was a slave owner, but he also hated he hated large plantation owners, because Johnson himself had grown up very poor, and he felt like rich large plantation owners who owned hundreds of slaves looked down on people like him. And so even though he himself owned a few slaves and was a Southerner from Tennessee, he did stay loyal to the Union, and that was really why he was put on the ticket with Lincoln in 1864, an effort to show Union, a Northern Republican and a Southern Democrat on the same ticket. And hey, it doesn't really matter that Andrew Johnson's in no way qualified to be president, because the vice presidency is no big deal. Of course, nobody expected Lincoln to be assassinated. So this is just a great quote here where Garfield is just kind of going off on Democrats and rebel guerrillas, jayhawkers, every man who ran to Canada, every bounty jumper, basically all the horrible people in the world you can think of. They're all Democrats and supporters of Andrew Johnson, is basically what he's saying here. This is another great quote from Garfield. This is he gave a really important speech here. And in fact, I think maybe I'll go to this slide. March 29th, 1879. So this period was interesting in that the federal government was facing what we would call today a government shutdown. And those of us that have worked for the government, Logan and myself included, know what this is all about. When basically you don't know if you're going to be able to go to work the next day. There are no appropriations to keep the government functioning. So the Democratic majority in Congress was threatening to withhold appropriations unless they could get some of the civil rights laws rescinded, or basically make it harder and harder for Black people to vote. And so they were basically threatening to let the government shut down, a lapse in appropriations. And so this is a speech Garfield gave that was a really powerful speech. And if you know the name Heather Cox Richardson, who's a really, really popular, very well-known, very smart historian right now, that's she publishes a daily newsletter and she publishes videos and all this stuff talking about sort of current events through a historical lens. She says that this is the speech that made James Garfield a presidential candidate. The speech that he gave on March 29th, 1879 in the House of Representatives, where he was attacking the Democrats for for basically letting the possibility of a government shutdown arise. If the Democratic majority cannot have its own way in certain matters not connected with appropriations, it will so use or refrain from using its voluntary powers to destroy the government. This is him talking to Southerners. In 1861, your leaders were heroic enough to withdraw from their seats, secede, in other words, and fling down the gauge of mortal battle. We called it rebellion. But you say if you cannot coerce an independent branch of this government, not that you will shoot the government to death as you tried to do before, but that you will starve the government to death. Starve meaning not pass appropriations bills. And eventually the Democrats did back down from this. And Garfield got a lot of credit for that because of this speech, which was widely published and widely read and widely admired. So anytime you've got a politician who's doing very well, getting a lot of good press, people start wondering, might this be a future presidential candidate? And that certainly was the case here for Garfield, even before this March of 1879 speech, but especially afterwards. This is a guy named Thomas Nickel talking to Garfield, talking about the fact that he was talking to somebody else, and there's already talking about the possibility of Garfield as a presidential candidate in 1880, and Garfield responding basically by saying, few men in our history have obtained the presidency by planning to obtain it. And basically saying, I'm not even going to let myself think about that. I've got other priorities. Obviously, it's very different now. People who become president because they want to be president and they run for president. But there were a number of people in our history that really weren't necessarily seeking the presidency, and it kind of fell to them as sort of a compromise candidate, as it did here with Garfield. And we'll see more about that as we go. So by 1880, Garfield was ready to move on from the House of Representatives. He'd been there since 1863, so 17 years. The schedule in the House was grueling. It was especially with having to run for re-election every other year. Garfield was, of course, he's only in his late 40s at this point, but at the time he viewed himself as getting older. what we wouldn't all give to be back in our late 40s, I guess, or at least I would. But so by 1880, Garfield's starting to think about what comes next for me. And the next logical thing for him was to try to become a senator, because in the Senate, those are 6-year terms. So you don't have that constant grind of having to campaign. And so he wanted to get elected to the Senate. And sure enough, there was an opening in the U.S. Senate. And of course, remember at this time, senators were not elected by the people. They were elected by the state legislatures. And so Garfield becomes, sort of quietly behind the scenes, lets it be known that, he'd be interested. And he gets support from the guy you see on the screen there, another great Ohioan, John Sherman, who at that point had been in the U.S. Senate representing Ohio for a long time, but at this point was the sitting Secretary of the Treasury for President Hayes. Sherman wanted to be president. So Sherman wanted to run for president in 1880. So he basically said to Garfield, I'll support you for the Senate if you'll support me for the presidential nomination. And Garfield said, sure, okay, we can do that. So in 1880, these are the major presidential candidates for the Republican Party. Of course, Ulysses S. Grant, who'd already been president for 2 terms, had now been gone and was interested in possibly coming back. In the middle there is James Blaine, Senator James Blaine from Maine. Yes, Blaine from Maine. It rhymes. It's easy to remember. And if you saw Death by Lightning, he was a pretty memorable character in that. So Blaine in the middle, and then on the end there, John Sherman from Ohio, the Secretary of the Treasury. This is a great political cartoon here. This shows Senator Roscoe Conkling from the state of New York, who was kind of the king of the patronage system, viewed himself as a kingmaker. This is the great presidential puzzle. So it shows Senator Conkling basically trying to figure out, move pieces around and figure out who was he going to anoint as the presidential nominee for the Republicans in 1880. Interestingly enough here, if you look closely enough, you'll see, you don't see James Garfield in here at all. And again, if you watch Death by Lightning, the Conkling portrayal in that series was one of my favorites. That guy portrayed Conkling like I think Conkling really was, just combative and wore the fancy clothes and everything, but really viewed himself as kind of a kingmaker. So here's former President Grant, of course, who'd already been president for 8 years after the Civil War. Um, was willing to come back if the party nominated him again because he was pretty disillusioned with Hayes. Um, a lot of people, including James Garfield, opposed this, not because they necessarily opposed Grant per se, but they didn't think anybody should run for a third term. Keep in mind, at this point, there's no constitutional amendment that says somebody can't run for a third term. Everybody had always limited themselves to 2 terms at most because that was the example set by George Washington. But it wasn't until the 1950s that there was a constitutional amendment saying presidents could only serve 2 full terms. So here's Garfield again in early 1880 talking to his diary about people already in his ear about possibly being a presidential candidate in 1880. And he's basically saying, I'm working for Sherman. I don't want to be the nominee. I don't want to be president. I don't want to hear anybody talking about this. But he also adds at the end here, I should have added that Mr. Sherman said that in case he could not be nominated, he preferred me to any other man and that he would be entirely willing to have his strength transferred to me. So, hey, Garfield's kind of playing both sides here, isn't he? He's saying, this is not for me. I'm going to the Senate. But if, something were to happen, he's keeping his options open, which, hey, there's nothing wrong with that. So, but it's interesting to see how he kind of tries to straddle the fence here a little bit. Here's again Garfield talking in April of writing in his diary in April of 1880, and somebody visiting President Hayes who says Sherman is in the field only to prevent the nomination of Grant. Hayes said that Garfield can carry Ohio solid, and so again, here's him recognizing that people are already kind of talking about him a little bit, and so again, he's trying to act like he's disinterested, but also keep his options open. So. The point here is that even though Garfield was something of a surprise in 1880, it wasn't a complete surprise. People had already started talking about him as a potential candidate, long before the Republican the Republican convention in 1880. So, and Garfield again is trying to sort of straddle the fence here a little bit, like a good politician. So Garfield does attend the Republican National Convention, and that's one of the reasons I believe he really did not think anything was going to come of this movement of people talking about him. At this point in American history, candidates who were candidates for president did not attend the conventions. It was seen as being too overly ambitious. It was unseemly. If you had any chance of being nominated, you were nowhere near that convention. And I think that Garfield understood that and respected that tradition enough that had he thought he was going to become president, he would have found a way to get out of going to this convention. The reason he went to the convention was he was pledged to support Sherman, and Sherman eventually even went so far as to ask Garfield to give the speech nominating Sherman as the Republican presidential nominee. So here's Garfield basically right before he leaves to go to Chicago saying, I really don't want to go. I dislike the antagonisms and controversies that are likely to blaze out from the convention. And then here's Roscoe Conkling, our friend from Death by Lightning, saying nothing but an act of God could prevent Grant's nomination. I wonder if he regretted saying that later. So Garfield goes to the Republican National Convention in 1880, held in Chicago, and he becomes a leader, not only leading Sherman's effort to win the nomination, but also opposing what they called the unit rule, which basically said if one candidate has a majority of a state's delegates, the votes of a state's delegates, they just win the whole state. So if Ohio has 35 delegates and Grant has 21 of those 35, he just gets all 35. And Garfield says, that's not fair. That's basically taking the vote out of an individual's hands. And so Garfield opposed the unit rule. The people that were supporting Grant, like Roscoe Conkling, they liked the unit rule because it was going to make it that much easier for their guy to win the nomination. But Garfield came out very strongly against the unit rule and did end up getting the unit rule defeated in the Rules Committee at the Republican National Convention. So that was a major tick up for Garfield's notoriety and popularity as well. And then here's, at one point, Conkling tried to expel some delegates from West Virginia. Garfield stood up for them and talking about these West Virginians who had also opposed the unit rule that Conkling was trying to eject basically from the convention, and Garfield stood up for them and said, no, I don't think that's fair. Their vote should count just like anybody else's. Again, just kind of his own reputation rising a little bit. And Conkling could kind of see what was happening here. He was a very astute politician. He realized that there was this very quiet groundswell building around James Garfield. And so at one point during some of the balloting, he actually wrote this note out to James Garfield and said, New York, Conkling was from New York, requests that Ohio's real candidate and dark horse come forward. So he's basically saying, hey, we know what you're doing. You're trying to get yourself nominated here, which I don't really think Garfield was, but I can certainly see why some people would think maybe that he was. This is a clip from Garfield's speech for Sherman. If you watched Death by Lightning, you saw a dramatization of some of the speech where he's basically saying, hey, this is the convention, it's summertime, everybody's blood is up, but this is not where the decisions are going to be made. The decision's going to be made in November when everybody goes to the polls. But I do love this quote here where he says, the Republican Party offers to our brethren of the South the olive branch of peace and invites them to renewed brotherhood on this supreme condition, that it shall be admitted forever that in the war for the Union, we were right and they were wrong. Just a great quote there. Garfield talking about the causes of the Civil War and who was right and who was wrong. So again, they're going through this balloting process at the convention. On the first ballot, 379 votes needed to win. You can see Grant and Blaine are running almost neck and neck. Sherman is far behind. Garfield knew all along Sherman was very unlikely to be nominated, but he had made the deal. Sherman supports Garfield for the Senate. Garfield supports Sherman for the presidential nomination, and Garfield intended to stick to that. So first ballot, 304 votes for Grant, all the way down to the 29th ballot. We're talking about a couple of days worth of ballots here. You can see the lines have not really moved that much. Sherman's gained a little, Grant has gained one, Blaine has lost a few. So the convention is definitely contested at this point because there is no front runner. Yes, Grant is still ahead, but he's still got a ways to go to get to that 379. And then all of a sudden, on the 34th ballot, this guy, John Cassaday from Wisconsin, suddenly starts this movement toward Garfield. Wisconsin cast 2 votes for General Grant, 2 votes for James Blaine, and 16 votes for James Garfield. And again, this was dramatized pretty well in the Netflix series. On the 35th ballot, suddenly you see, whoa, who's bringing up the rear here? It's James Garfield with 50 votes. On the 36th ballot, Garfield becomes the nominee. Delegates were, they were hot. They were tired. They'd been there for days. This had gone on longer than anybody had thought. When they saw an opportunity to get someone nominated, excuse me, and someone that most people liked, most people thought was, a very, very good representative of the Republican Party, there was this groundswell of movement toward Garfield. And so he was nominated as a compromise candidate on the 36th ballot. Again, he's the first candidate in American political history, the first presidential candidate to be present at the convention that nominated him. Because again, candidates did not go to conventions if they thought they had any chance of winning. So here's the Republican ticket, James Garfield, Chester A. Arthur. Arthur was from New York, was an acolyte of Roscoe Conkling, owed most of his career to Conkling's patronage. And again, if you saw Death by Lightning, Arthur was portrayed very, I'll say interestingly, by Nick Offerman, famous from Parks and Recreation and a bunch of other things too. But it was a fun portrayal of Arthur in Death by Lightning. So the Democratic nomination, the real question here was if Samuel Tilden would run again. Tilden, of course, being that nominee in 1876 who won the popular vote, but then lost the Electoral College because of the Electoral Commission and the disputed electoral votes from South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. Tilden, frankly, his health had taken a real downturn in those 4 years between 76 and 80. And he kind of played coy about whether or not he wanted to run again. And he said, well, I'll run, but only if it's unanimous. And the Democratic Party just basically said, yeah, that's okay. We'll find somebody else. So here are a look at some of the major Democratic candidates in 1880. That's Thomas Bayard from Delaware there on the left. Stephen J. Field in the glasses with the beard and the bald head. My brother there with the bald head. He was actually a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court at that point. Third, you see Winfield Scott Hancock in his general's uniform sitting in a chair. And then Thomas Hendricks on the right from Indiana. Hendricks had been the vice presidential nominee under Tilden in 1876. So why did Winfield Scott Hancock? First of all, it was not unusual at this point in history for active duty, still serving generals to be presidential candidates. So this was, even though it sounds weird to us today, it would never happen today. Because of conflict of interest, and you'd have to retire and before you could run, anything like that today. That wasn't the case then. Why were Democrats interested in Hancock? Well, first of all, he had never been elected to any office, so he had no political record to criticize. He couldn't be held to account for votes he'd given or speeches he'd given or anything like that because he'd never done any of that. I think even more importantly, Hancock negates the bloody shirt argument for Republicans in 1880. Basically, waving the bloody shirt was the ability of Republicans for several elections after the Civil War to what they call wave the bloody shirt, which was basically to say you should not vote for Democrats because they're the party of treason, they're the party of slavery, they're the party that put 300 and some thousand Union soldiers in their graves. You should vote for Republicans because we're the party of Lincoln, the party of freedom, the party of emancipation, and the party that was loyal to the Union. That's waving the bloody shirt. You can't really wave the bloody shirt at Winfield Scott Hancock. The guy went to West Point. He fought in the Mexican-American War. He fought for the Union in the Civil War, nearly died at Gettysburg from a very serious wound. You cannot wave the bloody shirt at him and say, hey, Democrats didn't fight for the Union. In this case, Winfield Scott Hancock certainly did. He was also, he's a lifelong Democrat, but he also was acceptable to Southerners because after the Civil War, he had done a very brief stint in New Orleans as the commander of the 5th Military District. And he did some things there that made Southerners think, hey, this is a guy that we can deal with. General Orders Number 40 that Hancock wrote in 1867, basically saying, the Civil War is over. We need to now turn all civil power back over to the proper civilian authorities. And of course, in the South, that meant white Southern Democrats who could then openly oppress and do even worse things to formerly enslaved people. So this was Hancock saying, the war is over. We should just turn all the power back over to white Southerners and let them do whatever they want because we were fighting to save the Union. And so white Southerners who knew about this said, okay, this is a guy we can deal with because he basically said we should have all of our power, all of our political power back. So in the 1880 Democratic National Convention, the first ballot, Hancock had 171 votes. Thomas Bayard, senator from Delaware, 158 and a half. I don't know how you get a half a vote, but that's what he had. You can see there the quote from the New York Times, which did not have a great track record on predicting presidential nominees in 1880. They had said Grant would win the Republican nomination, and they said, oh, Hancock will never win the Democratic nomination. And on the second ballot, Hancock wins the Democratic presidential nomination. Former Congressman William English of Indiana becomes the vice presidential nominee. Here's the New York Times. Was that the New York Times before? Yeah. Here's the New York Times when the news breaks that Hancock is the nominee. The New York Times saying, does anyone know what Hancock thinks about finance, tariff, civil service reform, interstate commerce? They're basically saying, hey, yeah, he had a great military career and that's honorable, but what does he know about all of these other issues that a president has to deal with? Here's the weakness of a Hancock candidacy when he's never been elected to any office. So the 1880 campaign, Garfield versus Hancock, just some great quotes here. Again, Garfield was told, don't give any speeches, don't write any letters, don't talk about politics, stay home, sit cross-legged and look wise, basically, don't campaign. And Garfield really had planned to follow that advice because that's what presidential candidates at the time did. This bottom view here is kind of an idealized view of Garfield's property in Mentor, Ohio, where I used to work, is now James A. Garfield National Historic Site. That's his wife, Lucretia, on the left. I love this quote from her where she says, yeah, I've had to travel fast and think faster ever since I have known you to keep even within seeing distance. So kind of a nice nod to his abilities and his ambition there from his wife. Hancock is living on Governor's Island in New York Harbor. He's still an active duty Army general, the commander of the Department of the Atlantic, and basically saying, I don't have much to say at this point. This is early on that, he hadn't even been officially notified yet that he was nominated. The Philadelphia Press here saying, hey, he was a good soldier, but that's really all there is to him. He doesn't have a political record at all. And then I love this quote from the St. Louis Globe Democrat. Hancock's nomination no more changes the character of the democracy meaning the Democratic Party, no more changes the character of the democracy than a figurehead of the Virgin on kids' pirate craft would change it into an honest ship. In other words, the Democrats can't change their stripes just by nominating somebody like Hancock. Roscoe Conkling, again, the senator from New York who was trying to get Grant renominated, was very angry when Garfield won the nomination instead of Grant. But Garfield recognized Conkling had a lot of power and a lot of followers. Garfield knew he had to get Conkling involved in this campaign or he wasn't going to win. And so somebody proposed that they hold a meeting of the Republican National Committee in New York. Garfield come from Ohio to that meeting. And the meeting was really just a front to get Garfield and Conkling in the same room to kind of iron out their differences. So Garfield says, well, I really don't want to go, but okay, I guess I'll do this. This is a lot to placate one man, he says. I'm paraphrasing, but something like that. And he goes, and then Conkling doesn't even show up. So Conkling just blows off the meeting with Garfield and doesn't even show up. And again, if you watch Death by Lightning, you probably saw a little bit of that in the portrayal of Conkling there and his personality. So again, Garfield doesn't give a lot of major speeches during this campaign, but when he's in New York for that meeting that Conkling blows off, he gives a speech that I think is one of his best speeches, again, talking about the Civil War and what the war was really all about. He gives this on the night of August 6, 1880 in New York City. And it's known as the Boys in Blue speech. And soon after the great struggle began, we looked behind the army of white rebels and saw 4 million, of Black people condemned to toil as slaves for our enemies. And we found that the hearts of these 4 million were God-inspired with the spirit of liberty and that they were all our friends. We have seen white men betray the flag and fight to kill the Union. But in all that long, dreary war, we never saw a traitor in a black skin. And now that we have made them free, so long as we live, we will stand by these Black allies. We will stand by them until the sun of liberty, fixed in the firmament of our Constitution, shall shine with equal ray upon every man, Black or white, throughout the Union. So here's Garfield again being a very strong proponent of civil rights. And he's basically reminding people, the war was about slavery. We have obligations to formerly enslaved people now that we have not fully lived up to. If I'm president, we will do that. Again, Hancock's still on active duty, the Democratic candidate as the commander of the Department of the Atlantic. He did see people who came to visit him, but only on unlimited hours. And his wife notes that our home was invaded from beginning to end. All was turmoil, excitement, and discomfort. Same thing happened at Garfield's home in Mentor when people started showing up there, but Garfield took a little bit different tack. This is one of my favorites here. This was a pamphlet that the Republican Party created during the 1880 campaign, and the title was "A Record of the Statesmanship and Political Achievements of General Winfield Scott Hancock." And when you open it up, it's just blank pages. Again, just reinforcing that he has no political record, no political experience, and he should not become president. Hancock did give one major interview to a newspaper during the campaign, and during that interview, he made a kind of a faux pas when he basically sort of blew off the importance of the tariff, where he basically said, it's not that big a deal. It's a local issue. which of course it wasn't. It was a national issue, and so that really kind of hurt his campaign and his candidacy. In Mentor, Ohio, people started showing up at Garfield's property. Reporters started calling the place Lawnfield, which, if you've ever been there, you know that name is still very popular in that part of Ohio. And so that's kind of where that name came from. They started calling it Lawnfield during the presidential campaign because it had some wide expanses of lawn. Garfield started speaking to people from the front porch of the house. So if you've ever heard of the front porch presidential campaign style, that started in Mentor, Ohio at James Garfield's home. He talked to, as you see on the screen there, businessmen. He talked to German immigrants in German, one of the first instances we know of a presidential candidate campaigning in a foreign language. He spoke to ladies' organizations, young men's organizations, Garfield and Arthur clubs, first-time voters. He was speaking to the public, which wasn't something that most candidates really did at that time. Even though he was speaking to these people that came to his property and he campaigned from his front porch, he was in a way campaigning for himself. And that, again, is something that most candidates at the time simply did not do. Grant and Conkling did visit the home in Mentor late in September to just kind of try to at least publicly show that the party was united behind Garfield. In reality, they really weren't. There was still plenty of tension, but the press dubbed that trip the Treaty of Mentor. Here's a scene that was recreated in the Death by Lightning series. In that series, Garfield is talking to some Civil War veterans. In reality, he was talking to the Fisk Jubilee Singers, who were an African-American singing group from Fisk University in Nashville, which is a historically Black university. And they had come and they sang for him and his family about a month before the election. And Garfield said, "I would rather be with you and defeated than against you and victorious." That scene is recreated to some degree in Death by Lightning. There was an October surprise in 1880. Someone created a forged letter purported to be written by Garfield, which supposedly showed that he supported unlimited Chinese immigration. The more things change, the more they say the same. We were talking about immigration in 1880. We're still talking about it today. Chinese immigration was a big issue at this time. A lot of people were very concerned about the number of Chinese immigrants coming in and supposedly taking jobs from Americans. Both parties actually favored limiting Chinese immigration in 1880. And so somebody created this fake letter, which was very quickly proved to be a forgery to try to trip up Garfield just a couple of weeks before the election. October 25th, 1880, two very important things happen. This group of African-American Civil War veterans visits Garfield's home in Mentor. That is the house in the background that you see there. And Garfield speaks to them and basically says, "What is freedom without the intelligence to use it wisely? Without virtue and intelligence combined to make it not a curse, but a blessing. You were not made free merely to be allowed to vote, but in order to enjoy an equality of opportunity in the race of life and to stand equal before the law." So that's October 25th, 1880. That very same night in New York at Cooper Union, Frederick Douglass spoke to a crowd that was primarily African-American. And he said, "James Garfield must be our president. I know Garfield, colored man. He is right on our questions. Take my word for it." So this is, the most famous Black man in the country saying Garfield needs to win this election next week. So here's where the 1880 election shook out. Again, red states and blue states. Red states are Garfield, the Republican. Blue states are Hancock, the Democrat. Garfield won the popular vote by something less than 10,000 votes. It was still the closest popular vote victory in American history. On the Electoral College side, it was far more decisive for Garfield, but he did just narrowly win the popular vote. And then Hancock's wife tells him when he wakes up the next morning, because when he went to bed, the election had not been decided. His wife says to him when he wakes up, "It's been a complete Waterloo for you," meaning you lost. And he says, "That's all right, I can stand it." And to his credit, Hancock was very gracious in defeat. He attended Garfield's inauguration, so there was no call for recounts or anything like that. Here's a quote from Garfield after the election. This is New Year's Eve, 1880. And I love this quote just because he basically says, I close the year with a sad conviction that I am bidding goodbye to the freedom of private life and to a long series of happy years, which I fear terminate with 1880. And of course, if you know anything about Garfield, you know that was 100% accurate because, of course, in 1881, he was shot. He suffers for 2.5 months and he eventually dies. And then here's a long quote, and I won't read the whole thing to you, from his inaugural address. The elevation of the Negro race from slavery to the full rights of citizenship is the most important political change we have known since the adoption of the Constitution of 1787. Again, this is Garfield talking about civil rights in his inaugural address. This is the most, he dedicated about a third of the address to civil rights. No president said as much about civil rights in an inaugural address until Lyndon Johnson in 1965. So again, Garfield for 1880 is very progressive on civil rights. And that's why I call him the last Lincoln Republican. So here's just a couple of images from his inauguration and inaugural parade on March 4th, 1881. And I close with, again, another plug for the book, which again, I created this PowerPoint back in 2020 when the book came out. So you please don't go out and buy the book. You don't have to do that, but I just throw it up there. So at that point, I am done. So Logan, if anybody wants to ask questions, I'm happy to try to answer questions anybody has. I know we're coming right up on the hour, but I'm happy to stay as long as you want and answer questions. And I can't really see or hear anything. So if somebody has a question, if you could repeat the question for me, I'd appreciate it.
No, my question is, in Death by Lightning, did you think that Chester Arthur was extremely exaggerated, or did he sometimes act the way he acted in that, drama?
Hey Logan, I couldn't make that out. Could you repeat that?
So
I wondered if in Death by Lightning, Chester A. Arthur was shown in a very, what seemed to me, exaggerated manner. Did he have that sort of personality really, or was that dramatic effect?
Yeah, great question. I could hear at that time. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, look, he was kind of portrayed, frankly, as, I mean, let's face it, kind of a buffoon, kind of a borderline drunkard. So I think it was very exaggerated. He was a gregarious guy. He loved to have a good time. But I do think it was a little exaggerated, and I think they did that. My guess is primarily so that it made his transformation at the end so much more powerful. Where Garfield believes in him, and when Garfield is being carried out, when he's going off to the seashore to die, and basically says that he knows Arthur can handle the job of being president, and Arthur has this sort of transformation. I think it was very much played up. It was an entertaining portrayal. I don't know that it was all that accurate, but it was fun to watch. But no, I think it was very exaggerated, and I think for that reason, again, so that it seemed more dramatic at the end when he did sort of convert and become very serious about the job of being president.
I agree. Anybody have a question? I have so many questions. Why was the popular vote so close? Based on what you described, why didn't Garfield win just walking away?
I'm not hearing anything, Logan. Sorry.
Oh.
Try it again.
So why was the popular vote so close?
Well, it's a great. Why was popular vote so close? That's a great question. Obviously, the parties are both kind of in transition at this point. You'll recall that in 1876, Tilden, the Democratic candidate, won the popular vote by about 250,000 votes. So the Democrats really felt like 1880 was theirs to lose, and that they had a very good shot to win. And frankly, they thought they won in 1876, and that Tilden had been sort of robbed of the presidency. But the parties were definitely both changing at this point. The Republicans had, their whole identity had been built around opposing the expansion of slavery, and then preserving the Union, abolishing slavery, winning the Civil War. And by 1876, and certainly by 1880, a lot of Republicans, even very staunch, civil rights Republicans, were kind of saying, okay, we've done everything we can do for formerly enslaved people. We need to find some new issues, some new alliances that will help us retain political power. And so a lot of Republicans at this point were turning toward financiers and industrialists, the so-called robber barons, if you will, to kind of create these new alliances that would allow them to stay in power. One of the few Republicans who was still very loudly banging the drum for civil rights was James Garfield. And so that's why I called him the last Lincoln Republican. And that's why I also think he was exactly the right person for that time to remind the Republicans of who they were and what their party had been founded on. And I think had he not been assassinated, I think he potentially at least could have been a very good, very strong, and very well-remembered president. You never know for sure, of course, but I think he certainly had that potential. The Democratic Party was kind of transitioning a bit too, in that even though they were still very much the party of white supremacy, they were now branching out into being willing to make some concessions to the North in order to win elections. And I think the greatest example of that is they were willing to nominate a guy who had fought for the Union and fought to destroy the Confederacy in Winfield Scott Hancock. So the parties were just kind of changing at that point. The electorate was changing. And, again, the Democrats won the popular vote in 1876, and they came really, really close in 1880.
So where did Garfield's commitment to civil rights come from? And I mean, his faith was part of it, his service in the Civil War was part of it, but did he know any Black people? He grew up in small towns in Ohio and in Western Massachusetts. Where did that come from? How did that evolve?
Yeah, great question. A lot of it did come from, Garfield, when Garfield was trying to figure out where to go to college, because after he went through the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, he specifically chose Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts, because he said he wanted to get into and experience the abolitionist atmosphere. So he already was thinking about this issue. But again, as I said, earlier on, that, for the most part, the disciples of Christ did not get involved in politics. So he hadn't done that yet, but he certainly was starting to develop some ideas about race. He was starting to understand what was going on in the country. And then when he got to Williamstown and he did hear those speakers on November 2nd, 1855, talking about, the travesty of what was happening in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers, I think that partially solidified it for him. I will also say there are at least two cases that we know of where he aided enslaved Black people who were trying to escape slavery. One of those was while he was it while he was at Williams or while he was still in Ohio? I can't remember, but it was while he had basically hid a Black person that was trying to avoid slave catchers. And then another time during the Civil War, he basically, when early in the war, when Blacks were treated as what they called contraband of war, he took in a black person to, kind of worked for him almost as like a manservant that was escaping slavery. So when I was the site manager at the Garfield home in Mentor, we actually, based on all of these things, the two known cases of helping enslaved people escape, his vocal support for abolition, his service to the Union, his dedication to civil rights as a member of Congress. We applied for and got the Garfield home on the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom because of all of these things that Garfield had done. And then we later also got it listed on the National Reconstruction Sites National Historic Network. Because again of all the things Garfield did after the Civil War for civil rights. So I think it came a lot from his faith, as you mentioned, his understanding of the Bible and of religion and of Christianity. And it's, of course, it's also easy. I mean, I'm sitting here in Virginia right now, so I'm in a state that was part of the Confederacy, where a lot of people saw justification for slavery in Christianity, and then a lot of people saw clearly that the Bible and Christianity was opposed to slavery. So people kind of were cherry picking, what they thought about what would God think of slavery. But Garfield's understanding of it was that it was an abomination, and that idea in his mind only solidified as he had more experiences and got older. Went to Williams, went back to Ohio, served in the Army, served in Congress. All of these things made him very serious about what he thought was the right thing to do for formerly enslaved people.
Thank you.
Thank you.